Well, turning now to campaign 2018 local matters. It was a night of firsts in Tuesday's primaries. Well, yesterday elections were held in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Connecticut and Vermont, setting the stage for more historic wins in November. In Vermont, a transgender woman won the Democratic Party nomination for governor. In Connecticut, voters could be sending their very first African-American Democrat to Congress. In Minnesota, a Democratic candidate is poised to become one of the first Muslim women in Congress. And in both Wisconsin and Minnesota, both major parties have women on the ballots for U.S. Senate. Joining me now, Scott Wong. He's a senior staff writer for The Hill. Okay, Scott, I don't know how better you can say it. It was a pretty strong night for women. We had Republican Leah Vukmir will face incumbent Tammy Baldwin in November. You've got Senator Tina Smith in Minnesota overcame a primary challenge. Will also face Karen Housley. Tough races. It's going to be for both of these two incumbent females senators moving forward. How likely do you think they'll be able to move on in November?
I think in the Wisconsin and the Minnesota races, we have to say that Democrats are favored in those races. I think in the Wisconsin race specifically, Leah Vukmir, she fended off a primary challenge from a very well-funded candidate who spent $10 million to try to defeat her. She was able to fend that off with support from Governor Scott Walker and Speaker Paul Ryan. Basically, the GOP establishment, she is the preferred pick for Republicans to take on Tammy Baldwin in November. But I do think Tammy Baldwin is slightly favored to hang on. Democrats feel good about her. They know that it will be a tough race, but Republicans think that if they can replicate sort of the magic in Wisconsin that they had in 2016, where they sort of ran the board, they think maybe this is an unexpected pickup opportunity for them. But right now, I would say both of those Minnesota seats and the Wisconsin seats in the Senate lean on the Democratic side.
You know, when you look at Vermont, Scott, Democrats elected the first transgender gubernatorial nominee for a major political party, Christine Hallquist. What are her chances against Republican Governor Phil Scott? It's a typically blue state, right?
It's typically a blue state, but as you mentioned, the Republican is the incumbent. Anytime you have an incumbent in there, they have a certain built-in advantage. They have a campaign apparatus. But clearly, the energy is on the side of Ms. Hallquist. She has a personal story. She has obviously garnered some national attention now. I think you'll start to see this really becoming more of a national race where money will be pouring in. It really depends on whether or not Democrats will have the momentum heading into November. So far, it looks like they will, and maybe Hallquist can catch a ride on some of that momentum. So right now, it's a toss-up, but clearly one of the more interesting races that we will be following in November.
You know, speaking of interesting races, I've always been fascinated in Connecticut. I spoke to one of the Democratic Party leaders who are talking about infusion of money from Asian folks who are really being active this time. But I can't believe I'm telling you that this could be the first African-American Democrat elected to Congress in November. I mean, it's 2018. We're talking about former Teacher of the Year, Jahana Hayes, and also Minnesota could be sending one of their first Muslim women to Congress. What's driving this sea change at this point, Scott?
You know, I think what's interesting to point out is that very early on, when President Trump first was elected to the White House, you saw, remember the day after that happened, there was the Women's March in Washington, D.C., and in cities around the country and around the world, women mobilizing, saying they were going to protest the election of Donald Trump. They were going to get involved, many of them marching and taking part in public protests for the first time. And a lot of those women decided to run for Congress. And I think you're seeing, that's mainly the reason why you're seeing so many female candidates, specifically on the Democratic side, for local races, for school board races, all the way up to Congress and the House and the Senate, because so many women are, excited, angry, frustrated at what's going on in the Trump administration and have decided to get involved. And I think in the case of This woman in Connecticut, a former national teacher of the year, not a politician by any means. She's one example of somebody who decided to get involved and jump into a race for Congress.
Yeah, Boy Scott, I tell you, if there was a list of disruptors in this election, I know it's too early to tell, but the school board has got to be one of the disruptors in this election. From coast to coast, we're seeing people who were teachers deciding they're getting out of the classroom because they've had enough and trying to make political change. It'll be fascinating to see what comes of that. I do want to also ask you about Congressman Keith Ellison actually winning the Democratic nomination for Minnesota Attorney General, despite all these allegations of abuse from an ex-girlfriend. Were you surprised by that? It's also the same state where Senator Al Franken stepped down over sexual misconduct. He was forced out by Washington, really. Do you see a difference in these two cases? And do you think that Al Franken should just stuck it out?
I can't speak for what Al Franken should or should not have done, but I will say that in the case of Keith Ellison, a lot of these allegations by his ex-girlfriend and the ex-girlfriend's son have been unsubstantiated to this point. There are allegations that there's a video or some kind of recording of domestic violence. So far, that has not materialized. In the case of Al Franken, we did see photographic evidence of him making light of groping women, and so there were photos that he could not dispute, and it was there for everyone to see. I will say that the Democratic National Committee, of which Ellison serves as vice chairman, he's the #2 official at the DNC, they opened an investigation and said they are reviewing these very serious allegations against Ellison. Remember, Keith Ellison is running to be the top cop, the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. And so
that's why I just don't understand this, Scott. If he's running to be the top cop and there's allegations against him of abuse, but the voters still voted him in. So, I mean, what does that say about the tide? Is there anything to be read in that?
I mean, it's going to be left up to voters in November. Like I said before, these allegations have not been independently substantiated. Unless we see further evidence, maybe voters are willing to stick with him. He is a progressive leader in the country. He is not only a leader at the Democratic National Committee, but the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus on Capitol Hill. He's known as a progressive leader. Obviously, if more evidence comes out against Keith Ellison, he will be in some real trouble.
I want to also ask you about Republican from Minnesota, Governor Tim Pawlenty, who actually failed to make a comeback. We know Jeff Johnson won the primary instead. So What can you sort of read from those results?
I think what we can read into that is Johnson portrayed himself as more of a loyal ally of President Trump and tried to paint Tim Pawlenty, the former two-term governor and former presidential candidate, as disloyal to President Trump, noting that he did not rally to Trump's defense during the Access Hollywood debacle in 2016. And so, as we've seen time and again, Republican primary voters come out in support of President Trump. They're loyal to President Trump, and they want to support people who are loyal to President Trump. And in this case, it simply was too much. It really was a wipeout. Pawlenty lost by almost 10 points. And at this point, I think a lot of people are seeing his political career elected political career as probably over.
A wipeout, interesting. I want to ask you, though, also about the president. He's tweeting out his endorsements for Republican candidates who won last night, Connecticut governor among them. How much do they want to align themselves with President Trump when it comes to the general elections versus the primaries? Is there a difference?
What we're seeing from Republicans, certainly in the primaries, they do want to align with President Trump. I think as we start to shift more and more to the general election, you will see a little bit of distancing from some candidates. Now, other candidates like Ron DeSantis in Florida, who's running for governor there, the president was just out stumping for DeSantis. He's very conservative. He believes that in order to win the state of Florida, he needs to drive out the conservative base. He's not running to the middle by any means, even though a lot of people believe that in Florida you do need to run to the middle to win that election. So people are taking different strategies, different tacks. Some are aligning and associating themselves with President Trump. Others will be running in the other direction.
Interesting. So before you go, Scott, I do want to ask you, while there's not a primary yesterday in Kansas, the incumbent Republican governor actually conceded last night in the gubernatorial race against Secretary of State Chris Kobach. Why did he do that? And what does it mean for the gubernatorial race there?
It was interesting. I was surprised, quite frankly, that that the incumbent governor decided to concede. There were only 345 votes separating the two men. The governor said he just did not see a path to victory. Obviously, they were crunching the numbers on a much more technical level than we were. But I think what it means is you now have a hardline, immigration hardliner conservative in Chris Kobach as the Republican nominee in Kansas. Democrats believe they have a chance now to take on Chris Kobach and perhaps win back the governorship in Kansas. Right now, Kansas is entirely red. The entire state government is controlled by Republicans. And so Democrats see this as perhaps an opening, and that maybe voters will revolt against a candidate that they believe is too far to the right.
It's going to be a fascinating election come November. Interesting to see all these primaries shake down. Scott Wong, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.